Perfect. So again, welcome to today's National Volunteering Forum. I am Nick, I'm the Networks Manager here at NCVO. And over the last 6 months, NCVO has been delivering a project funded by the Centre for Ageing Better on age-friendly, inclusive volunteering. Today, we're really excited to share with you the principles of age-friendly and inclusive volunteering. We'll share learning from some of the action and learning sets that have been facilitated as part of the project, and we'll give you the opportunity to discuss with other volunteering professionals how you can start to apply these principles, which we'll introduce shortly, within your volunteer programmes and organisations. But before we look at what's in store for the next 90 minutes, there are just a couple of housekeeping points that I wanted to note. So closed captions have been enabled for today's event, and you can turn these on or off by clicking on the CC icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. To help with accessibility, the slides for today's event will be shared into the chat in just a moment as a PDF. So if it would help, you can download these to your computer, to your desktops, and you can zoom in and out of the slides as we go along today. With your microphones, please could you keep them muted during today's presentations. You're welcome to have your cameras on or off, but having them on in the breakout discussions a little later on could help the conversation to flow. Please share your own views and reflections as well on the things that you hear today in the chat. And if you've got any questions that you'd like to put to today's speakers, pop them into the chat and we'll collate them together for a Q&A towards the end of the session. Finally, if you are tweeting about today's event and the discussions that take place, please use the hashtag #VolForum and tag us at NCVO. So in just a moment, I'll be handing over to Rachel Monaghan from the Centre for Ageing Better, who will help set the scene for the conversation today, introducing the aims and the work of the Centre for Ageing Better and how the work around age-friendly and inclusive volunteering came about. We'll then be welcoming Laura Elson, one of NCVO's associate consultants who's been leading on this project. Laura will offer an overview of what the latest research tells us about older people and volunteering. She'll cover the aims of the project and introduce us to an age-friendly, inclusive volunteering outcomes framework that we've developed. Now, as part of this project, Laura has recruited and convened a group of volunteer leaders from a range of organisations to work together to identify the key barriers and enablers for people aged 50 and over to engage in volunteering opportunities. So to share some of the learning from this part of the project, we'll be welcoming Susanna Hodge, the Training and Regional Support Manager from U3A, the Third Aid Trust, and Judith Keegan, the Senior Operational Manager for Volunteering and Training at Age UK Nottingham and Nottinghamshire. It will then be over to you at around 11:15 for discussions in facilitated breakout groups before coming back together in this main room for a Q&A with Rachel, Laura, Judith and Susanna. So just as a reminder, if you've got any questions that you have, please pop them into the chat. We should be ready to wrap up today's session by 11:25, closing things out by 11:30. Needless to say, that's a fair amount to cover in a short amount of time. So to get started, I'm pleased to hand over to Rachel from the Centre for Ageing Better.
Hi everyone, and thanks very much, Nick. It's really a great delight to be here because I've been working with Laura and other colleagues at NCVO on the work that you've been doing, and really happy to hear how that work has been going. I'm going to start off, like Nick said, to give a little bit of background, a bit of context. So I'll tell you a bit about Centre for Ageing Better, and then also a little bit around how we came to be doing the work on community contributions. So our population is changing. In the UK, many people are living longer and the age profile in society is changing. This graphic here shows that there's going to be almost a third more people aged 65 and over in the next 20 years. So this is a really big change. And we know everyone has the right to a good life as they get older, and everyone benefits from that, society, individuals. But too many people face really big barriers to ageing well. And as a result, people are living in bad housing, dealing with poverty and poor health, and they're made to feel invisible in their communities and society. So at the Centre for Ageing Better, we're pioneering, we're searching for ways to make ageing better a reality for everyone. If you want to go on to the next slide, Nick, thank you. So to do that, we're focusing our work on 3 areas of action. One is an age-friendly movement and tackling ageism. we're building a movement across the country focused on the UK network of age-friendly communities, which is part of the World Health Organization programme. So it's where local authorities commit to making their locality age-friendly. I imagine that quite a few people on the call today are from areas that are signed up as age-friendly communities, but it's a great initiative. We're also working on age-friendly employment, so influencing policy and practice so that more people have access to good jobs that are right for them, that work in ways that work for them in their 50s and 60s. And that's a really hot topic at the moment, loads in the media and the press. And we're also working to ensure that everyone can live in age-friendly, accessible and healthy homes. So, what's the background to what we did around age-friendly and inclusive volunteering? So at Aging Better, from about 5 years ago, I think we were working to try and understand community contributions that people made in later life. We were interested to find out who made those contributions, what they did, how they did it, and what were the benefits to them. We talked about contributions in sort of in terms of a spectrum. So that's going right from small contributions, sort of acts of neighbourliness, taking the bins out for your neighbour, picking some shopping up for someone, right through to much more formal kinds of volunteering, like perhaps being a school governor even, or regular working in a charity shop once a week, that sort of formality. So we wanted to look to try and understand right across the spectrum, but as you can imagine, understanding work around more informal volunteering is much more difficult to do. So we commissioned some research to try and understand a bit more about that. We looked at all the existing evidence. We did calls for practice from volunteer involving organisations, asking them what they did, how they did it. And when we held lots of focus groups, conversations, roundtables with members of the public, with organisations, with professionals, with policymakers. And from that review, we then moved on to a grant programme to test out the findings of the review in the real world. But just sort of as an overview, we found out that making a contribution in communities has proven wellbeing benefits for individuals as well, of course, for the community. It can help to keep us connected and give our lives meaning and purpose. So most people in life have some experience of community contributions, but not always considered volunteering. Like I said, those acts of neighbourliness. Lots of people described it as, well, that's just what you do. But then not everyone has or feels they have the same access to opportunities for formal volunteering. So we wanted to try and understand why that was. But first of all, let me just give you a quick view on the next slide of who we found was volunteering or not. So this is just a sort of overview statement. But importantly, we found that it's not age that's a determinant whether people volunteer or not. Like it says here, it's more likely that people who are healthy get involved, and it's more likely that people who are wealthy get involved. So those are really key to ensuring that people feel they're able to take part. We also found that people who have a habit that they develop earlier in life are more likely to carry that on. But really importantly, we found that when people's circumstances change, they're likely to drop out of volunteering, they don't feel able to start volunteering, or they don't know how to go back into things. And those are circumstances which particularly affect people as they age. So things like onset of health conditions, bereavement, extra family responsibilities, and so forth. So on the next slide, I'm just going to mention, and I know Laura is going to cover this in much more detail, what the review suggested. So the review suggested that there were 3 key barriers that people face: practical, structural, and emotional barriers to getting involved. I know that these affect people of all ages, but we've found that particularly emotional barriers were strongly felt by people as they get older. So that feeling of confidence to get involved, feeling that they might not be welcome, feeling that what they have to contribute isn't really recognised. Those were particularly felt by older people. Again, Laura's going to cover this much more. I think the principles and actions that we suggested would help people to feel able to volunteer were tested, like I mentioned before, through a grant programme and evaluated. And these actions coming out of here, so connect and listen, focus on what matters to people, play to people's strength, remove barriers, be flexible, were all things that we suggest are really ways that people can be supported to feel able to take part in ways that work for them as well. So we've got lots more information online about the grant programs that I encourage you to take a look at, but we're really delighted that NCVO have been able to take on the learning from this piece of work and make sure that it's spread to as many people as possible, and that it has life after our review ended. So my final slide is actually just what's the word? A shameless plug. So at the Centre for Ageing Better, we have an age positive image library. So we've got, as it says here, it's the first free library that shows positive and realistic images of people over 50. And it's a bid to challenge those negative views of ageing. I'm sure we've all seen the wrinkly hands photos or photos of older people in shadow or looking away from camera. These photos are totally different. It's got 2,000 images already, regularly updated. And I'd really like to encourage everybody to access that. I know that when you're, for small organisations, having a bank of images can be a real challenge. So please make use of that. Please have a look at our website as well to find out more about the work that we did. But I'm going to hand back to Nick and just say I'm really looking forward to hearing what Laura's got to say. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. And don't worry about the shameless plugs. I think everyone online today do kind of plug the work that you are doing, particularly if you are if you're doing some really kind of positive projects where you have engaged successfully kind of older volunteers. We'd love to hear about that. So if you could share any links to that in the chat, that would be brilliant. But so Rachel's going to lay the kind of foundations of this project. But we can now go on to our second presenter, who is Laura Elson, and she's an associate consultant here at NCVO, and she's been leading on the age-friendly inclusive volunteering project here. So to introduce the project and the work that's been undertaken so far, Laura, it's over to you.
Good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to be here to talk about this fantastic project, which has just been a complete joy to be involved in, especially the action learning sets, two of the participants of which will be speaking after me to give you a little bit about their learning and how they found the programme. But as Nick said, yes, I'm Laura Elson. I'm an associate consultant in volunteering here at NCVO. So I'm one of a pool of freelancers that support NCVO with the delivery of projects like this. In addition to that, I'm also the trustee of an older people's charity myself. So I'm the trustee with volunteering lead responsibility for Bramley Elderly Action here in West Leeds, where it's very snowy today. So it's been fantastic for me personally to be involved in this project, and I've taken lots of learning away from my own work with older volunteers too. So if I could have the next slide, please. So what I'm going to do with these slides is just follow on from Rachel, really, with giving you a bit of the background to the project and why NCVO was so pleased to be supporting and delivering this work and capturing some learning. I'll also go through some of the latest statistics that we have on older people volunteering, and I will talk about the action learning sets that we've delivered as part of this programme, which was the part of the work that I helped deliver. So just to follow on from Rachel, really, the impetus behind this sort of project was that we know, I think as volunteer managers, when we think about volunteers and perhaps their age range of the volunteer bases within our own organisations, I think we can often feel complacent that older people are quite well represented in most organisations. And in lockdown, 30%, so almost 1 in 3 of people aged 50 to 70, were informally volunteering, and 87% of them wanted to continue that. So we know we've got older people who are active in volunteering and have a desire to want to do more of it. Behind that as well, we've also got, another reason really to be thinking about this quite deeply, which is that we have got an ageing population. So in less than 20 years, 1 in 4 of us will be over 65, so in that retired bracket. So we'll be looking to think as volunteer involving organisations, how can we make sure that our organisations are as inclusive and age friendly as they can be now, so that as we have an ageing population, we're able to ensure that as many volunteers as possible can get involved. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go through some of the data that we've got here at NCVO about volunteering for these older age groups. So we're looking at the right hand side of this graph, which is the 50 plus group, the 65 plus, and then the 75 plus group. And you can see from the graph, which comes from NCVO Civil Society Almanac from 2020-2021, that people aged 50 plus and 65 plus were among the most likely to formally volunteer during that first year of the pandemic. But what we've also seen is that the age group of people aged 65 to 74 were the age group that were most likely to volunteer on a regular basis. So if I could have the next slide, please. I think this has come from the most recent Community Life Survey. So this is hot off the press, and the Community Life Survey is one of the sources of data that NCVO uses for the Civil Society Almanac and data on volunteering. And you can see that because this is coming from the most recent form of the data, we can see that over the last 10 years in England, we have been having a decline in volunteering, and that has really started to sharply decline further since the pandemic. So I think since the pandemic, we're seeing that volunteering really hasn't recovered overall across all age groups, which is another reason for us to think about how volunteering can be inclusive, not just to older people, but across all age groups. If I could have the next slide, please. So this slide comes from the latest Community Life Survey again, and I think this is really useful because it shows us what has happened with participation in formal volunteering for the last 2 years. So this is from the year when we had the height of pandemic disruptions and lockdowns, and also the most recent 12 months following that as well. And I think that what's really encouraging about this most recent data is that we can see that since the pandemic, volunteering amongst the age groups of 65 to 74, and also that older age group of 75 plus, seem to have stabilised with formal volunteering since the pandemic. But I think what's really interesting and pertinent to this project is if you look at the graph columns that show volunteers who are aged 50 to 64, it's actually decreased by 6% since the pandemic. So I think what that tells us is that since the pandemic, volunteering amongst this age group of younger older people, we might call them, so people who are late in their careers or perhaps in early retirement, has dropped further. And so with this project, what we wanted to do was think particularly about how we could engage that group of people to bring them back into volunteering and support them to volunteer further in later life. Next slide, please. So I'm here just to tell you a little bit about the project and how it was delivered as well. So I was recruited in November, so midway through the project, to help deliver the action learning sets and support with some of the evaluation work. And the project really had 2 main aims. So one of these were to embed the principles of age-friendly, inclusive volunteering into volunteering organisations. So those 5 principles that Rachel mentioned earlier. And another aim was to really encourage organisations to adopt the principles as actions by creating spaces and conversations for them to work through. So that's the action learning sets that we've been facilitating for volunteer leaders. Next one, please. So I'll just go into those barriers that Rachel mentioned earlier a little bit further. So at the beginning of the project, NCVO were considering the barriers identified by the Centre for Ageing Better and thinking about what those might be. So in terms of the practical barriers that older people face to volunteering, We found that those might be cost, or it could be transport needs for older people getting to venues where they might be volunteering, physical access support for older people who perhaps have mobility needs, and there may be language barriers as well. We also looked at some of those structural issues that might be barriers for older people getting involved in volunteering. So that could be a lack of flexibility. So how does volunteering fit around commitments with grandchildren or hobbies or part-time work? A lack of neutral spaces for people to come into. Something that came up actually in the action learning sets is a sense of bureaucracy sometimes that older people might feel when they're volunteering. I think after a long career in work, some volunteers within that age group find the paperwork associated with volunteer induction not something that they want to be doing, and that can be a barrier. And then finally, that emotional, so personal and individual aspect. So, you know, are organisations, you know, doing enough to combat any ageism that older people might be experiencing? Are older people feeling welcomed and supported when they start to volunteer? So those are the barriers that we explored. And the next slide just shows a reminder of the principles. So NCVO held a workshop in April 2022 with leaders of volunteering from a broad range of organisations, from large national ones to very small community-based organisations. And we thought together about these particular principles, which are connect and listen, focus on what matters to people, play to people's strengths, remove some of these barriers, and to be flexible. And as Rachel has said, these principles work for lots of different groups of people in volunteering. It's about making things accessible and being person-centred. But we wanted to think about them more deeply in terms of what they might mean for older people. So the next slide shows an outcomes framework. So as a result of the workshop that NCVO held in April 2022, our learning and evaluation team were able to capture some of the feedback and experiences of these volunteer managers and add a little bit more depth to create an outcomes framework, which we hope will be really useful for organisations in terms of thinking really practically and tactically about how you tackle some of these barriers to include older volunteers. And you'll see we've got these strands of individual positive outcomes. So this might be using the principles to make sure that volunteers feel welcome. We've got organisational barriers split into two different types of sets of positive outcomes here. So we want to make sure that organisations are thinking about, you know, the practical ways that they can reduce barriers to older volunteers getting involved, as well as the cultural barriers and being welcoming to older people. And finally, our final list of positive outcomes that we wanted to see as a result of this project are a shift in the volunteering sector. So we wanted as NCVO to play a role in supporting the volunteering sector as a whole to become age-friendly and inclusive. So we've shared this outcomes framework on our website in a series of blogs. So if you want to access it, there'll be a link at the end of this session where you can take it and have a think about how that might work in your organisation. Next slide, please, Nick. So just to wrap up, I'm just going to describe a little bit more about practically how the project worked before I hand over to our participants. So we had some different components to the project. We had an advisory group, which was made up of 5 volunteer managers who represented a whole range of different organisations, from a director of volunteering in a large national charity through to a volunteer coordinator in a local public service. And that group met twice, so early on in the project, to help shape how the project should work, you know, and to give some guidance as to the action learning set format. We developed the outcomes framework, which you've just seen. We delivered action learning sets, and we've also embedded the principles and the actions into NCVO's Good Practice in Volunteer Management training course. So that is one of our most popular courses that happens every month. And to date, we've supported 340 volunteer managers to reflect on these principles and the outcomes framework as part of that course. So I think the next slide just gives you a little bit of information about the action learning sets. So if you've not been involved in one of these before, an action learning set is a particularly structured form of peer support. And the idea is that you have a confidential and supportive space for learners to come together with people in similar roles. We have one person each time who is able to bring confidentially a challenge from their own role as a volunteer manager in terms of involving older volunteers, and the rest of the group provide really structured peer support, so asking a first round of questions that help to unpick and explore the context a little bit, and then another round of questions which are a little bit more open, where participants get the chance to suggest and share what's worked for them in their organisations. And each time as a group, we reflect together about what we've learned and how we've supported each other. And it's honestly been wonderful facilitating that group. There's been some fantastic people in there, and really supportive learning environment. And we've had great feedback from the group about how the structure of an action learning set helps people to think in different ways and creative ways about problems. So I think, is there a next slide, Nick? So I think that's my final slide. So I'm really pleased and delighted at this point to hand over to our first action learner who took part in those action learning sets, Susanna.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I will just say, typically I'm in the office today and they've started doing some very noisy building work downstairs, but hopefully my headphones won't pick up the drilling. Yeah, so thank you very much, Laura, and it's been great to be part of this project. So yeah, Judith and I are just going to share a few learnings. And Nick, if you could just go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm Susanna, I'm from the UCVA. And just to give a bit of context, I guess, the UCVA, for those who don't know, it's a national charity. We have a very small staff team who provide support to around 400 UCVAs across the UK. The UCVAs are each their own individual organisation, registered charities in many cases, so they have their own committee, of which those are, for where needed, they are trustees. And we as a staff team provide kind of umbrella support for all of them. Each UCVA, they look at offering kind of lifelong learning opportunities to people. And the vast majority of members are people who are either retired, are nearing retirement, or people in their third age, as I guess we refer to them. So yeah, it was really useful, I guess, to be part of this project. And as Laura was talking about those action learning sets, being able to come along with our challenges and discuss those with peers across the sector. It was really great to have that protected time. I think lots of us would probably agree you can get quite easily swept up in your day-to-day work, and you kind of just keep going on the momentum every day. But actually sometimes being able to take a step back and reflect is really helpful. And that's what I guess some of these action learning sets provided to all of us. It was really great as well to network with those across the sector. People in a really vast range of different organisations was really helpful. And I think, as Laura said, it wasn't just kind of networking and coming together and discussing. The action learning sets gave us a really a structured way to do this, and I think it was a very safe and confidential space, but being asked probably quite probing questions about your challenge, and from people I think that also are external to your organisation was really helpful. They perhaps don't have some of the preconceptions about your organisation, or perhaps know but perhaps some of the detail, so they can ask questions that can make you think kind of quite outside the box and see your challenge in quite a different perspective. And so it was really great to be able to explore kind of new ideas and perspectives. I guess, yeah, one of the main takeaways and I guess this has been mentioned already, is that lots of the key principles are really relevant to volunteers of all ages. Some of the organisations who took part in the action learning sets had volunteers who were in the older age groups, but also had volunteers who were in younger age groups. And I've definitely worked in organisations that have had younger volunteers as well in the past, and I think lots of the principles are really relevant, but also we did have those conversations about also where they are perhaps more relevant, or perhaps in a different way to people who are to older volunteers. Yeah, and as I said before, it was just really helpful to take a step back from some of the challenges we're facing, and just explore it with others and have those questions. I guess in terms of the challenge I took along to the action learning set, it was a challenge I hear quite often from our members, which is that from their members, each UCVA recruits members to their committee, and they are often trustees. But what we're getting, and I guess is reflected in some of the other data we've seen, is that lots of people are struggling to recruit those volunteers to take on the commitment and step up and be on the committee and become a trustee. So how can we be providing better or more support to those U3As, and how can we perhaps be encouraging more people to step up to that challenge. And I think this is probably not a challenge that's exclusive to us. I suspect it's a challenge that's across the sector as well in lots of places. And some of the ideas we discussed, I think, were areas we'd already looked at in terms of making roles more flexible, sharing roles, providing support and training. But I think the action learning encouraged me to kind of look at some of those challenges through different angles. And as a result, we've now been looking at, I guess one of the areas I took away from the action learning set was how we can perhaps raise awareness of training support that we offer. We do offer it, but perhaps it's not as well known about across all of our U3As. So as a result, we've set up what we are calling kind of an online learning and a sharing session, where we've got 3 members from 3 different U3As across the UK who are going to come and talk about their challenges they faced when they were recruiting members to their committees, the different things they did to overcome those challenges, and perhaps learning they might want to share. And then we're going to have some breakout spaces as well for members to then kind of take away and share ideas with each other. We limited the numbers. It's a bit of a pilot session we're hosting next week, but it sold out within a day or so. So yeah, bookings filled up. So, I think it's something that is really needed. So I guess we'll reflect on it once we've held it and kind of see what happens. What happens next. So I guess, yeah, that's my kind of journey through the action learning set. It's been a really helpful thing to take part in. And now I'm going to hand over to Judith.
Thank you, Susanna. Okay, Nick, lovely. Thank you. Right, so I'm Judith Keegan from Age UK Nottingham and Nottinghamshire, and just for those of you who might not be aware, we are an independent charity in our own right, but we come under the Age UK national umbrella. So, and I've noticed colleagues here from there. So yeah, we sit under the umbrella, but we are a charity in our own right. So for me, thinking back about the action learning sets, it was a really new way of exploring real life challenges in a safe and confidential space. And I guess sometimes in volunteering, it can be quite lonely, and some of the challenges that we come across are quite niche. If you're working on your own or within a small team, you're the expert on or you're perceived to be the expert on volunteers and volunteering. So it was lovely to have the opportunity to present a challenge to a group of people all working in the same sector, which for me it was really encouraging, but the creative thinking that the structure brought about, I just thought was really wonderful. I think Susanna already mentioned that attendance across the sessions wasn't consistent. And I just feel that was a real shame, because it was an opportunity to be supported and encouraged in that confidential space and discuss real life challenges rather than hypothetically what we would do. And those opportunities don't come around very often. And as a leader of volunteers, I think we should build in our own time. We should build in time for our own learning and development, which participating in this type of event actually really supports. So for me, the benefits on the slide: real life experience, a safe confidential space, and for me, it helped me to think more creatively and out of the box. The main takeaway for me from the session, like Susanna, was that many of the barriers that exist to volunteering can be related to all ages, not just older volunteers. And in an organisation that exists for older people, there's still more that we can do to ensure our volunteering becomes even more age friendly. And attending those action learning sets has kind of reminded me of that. And also helped me to think in a different way, really. So rather than seeing things perhaps as a challenge, look at them as an opportunity to do things differently and to sort of put some creative solutions in, which again is just reflected in the takeaways that I've put up on the slide. The challenge I posed, interestingly, was about a particular set of volunteers who are actually all older volunteers themselves. So they're all 60 plus. And they're in a specific service, and unfortunately they were preventing the service from flourishing and growing because of a historical lack of connection of that service to the charity and its policies and procedures. and also a dislike for anything digital or online. These volunteers are all highly intelligent people who, when they were working, often held really well-paid professional roles, and were used to being decision makers and being leaders. Some of the feeling around lack of connection between the service and the charity is historic, or was historic, and to a certain extent we had to draw a line under that after listening to the volunteers, because what has happened, and we aren't going to go back to how things were. And that message we've been communicating bottom up and top down, and that seems to be filtering through with less of a referral to the old days when. One of the things, however, that came up at the action learning sets because we're in the process of putting our 10-year strategy together, into which volunteering will feed, that it would be an ideal opportunity to involve those volunteers to help shape a way forward. So that means they can see where their charity is heading and can input to that strategy based on the new way forward, rather than how things used to be. This is still very much in its infancy, but I do feel that I've got a map to follow, that I can help make those volunteers feel more involved and also use the skills that they had when they were at work. Online training and training full stop was a massive issue with these volunteers. They didn't understand why, when they'd been at work, they also had to do the training as a volunteer. So what actually happened with the training is we've now given options to do it both online and on paper, whereas previously it was only online. So there's an opportunity for those who don't like digital. We do also have the benefit of a digital inclusion service where we can now refer those volunteers to, so they can become a service user in that service if they wish to. But what I also did was, with the help of a colleague from National, made the training more volunteer specific and included some very volunteer specific examples, so that the people who said, well, why do I need to do that training again, because I've done it in my working life, could actually see how it related to them as a volunteer. I included many of those people from this service in the pilot that went out in December, and I've had some really positive feedback about it. So I think involving them in key pieces of work is building bridges and trust, and it's getting that relationship back on track. So the follow-up actions for me are involving the volunteers, or these particular volunteers, to support the development and improvement of the volunteering strategy for that service, and also improve communication with that specific set of volunteers to help them feel more closely connected to the charity. So thank you. Back to Nick.
Awesome. Thank you, Judith, and thank you, Susanna, for kind of sharing your experiences of being part of the kind of action learning sets for this project, and also how you kind of turn some of those kind of challenges into opportunities and being able to embed some of those principles in your work and the way that you work with kind of older volunteers as well. But now, having heard from our speakers, it's time to kind of hand over to you to share your thoughts and your reflections on what we've heard today so far. So in just a moment, my colleague Sophie is going to send us away into breakout groups to discuss how we can adopt the 5 principles of age-friendly inclusive volunteering as volunteering involving organisations and also volunteering leaders, what the challenges we face currently in including older volunteers, and perhaps kind of what resources do volunteer involving organisations need to be inclusive to older volunteers. Now, each of these breakout groups will have a facilitator, either from the speakers that you've heard from today or from some of my NCVO colleagues, so from Catherine, Sarah, Helen or Miriam. So in just a moment, on your screen, you will be invited to join one of kind of 7, I think, in different kind of breakout groups. So if you can please click yes, and we'll be back here in this main room at just about kind of 10 past 11 for the Q&A with our speakers today. But by all means, can you please kind of feel free to kind of add your kind of email address kind of into the chat for the people who you were just having conversations with, and you can always pick those conversations up again kind of offline, if that makes sense, if not it's online, but maintain that kind of contact. But now we've kind of got just under kind of 15 minutes kind of left for a Q&A with our kind of presenters today. So just a reminder, if you've got any questions that you'd like to put to Rachel, to Laura, to Judith or to Susanna, please feel free to pop any questions that you've got into the chat. Similarly as well, you can always kind of put your hand up by using the kind of reactions button in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen, and we can come to you and you can ask your your kind of question verbally as well. But Laura, kind of you kind of referenced the fact that this kind of project, you developed your own kind of action, you developed your own action learning sets. And why are these kind of useful kind of for this project, but kind of generally anyway?
Yeah, so I'm a bit of an advocate of the action learning set model. I did a master's in charity effectiveness about 10 years ago, and it was the model that they used to help students on the master's course work through tricky charity work situations together. And as a participant, it's really powerful stuff. I think just the structure that you go through makes you think creatively, and it stops that very human urge to just go, have you tried this, you know, and kind of jump in. You're forced to really actively listen to one another, to tackle problems creatively, and it creates a really wonderful sense of peer support, which is really useful. And you know, in a previous role, I facilitated the volunteer management action learning sets at Parkinson's UK for anyone who worked at the charity nationally that worked with at least one volunteer. And so I knew that I loved facilitating those sessions. So I'm really passionate about it. And I think that, you know, there's definitely a need for peer support amongst volunteer managers. And I would love to see more spaces opened up and networks for us to come together and kind of talk generally. But I think the action learning set format has been great for this project because it's enabled, you know, we've had members from who are in very senior roles in huge national charities, right down to tiny grassroots community organisations, all learning from one another, you know, and people who work in enormous organisations taking away learning from supporting a peer in a very small organisation. And finally, I think that, you know, the real benefit that we talked about in the group is that the organisations people represented were from quite different sectors. And there are networks out there, say, for people who work in environmental charities or, you know, people who work in heritage and cultural charities as volunteer managers. But what was nice about this group was that there were people from lots of different types of charity sector, all sharing best practice and learning together. So yeah, it was just lovely to facilitate. I really enjoyed being part of it.
Great, and I think kind of from your action learning sets, we kind of brought together a very kind of a diverse kind of group of people, kind of from different types of organisations from all around the country. From those kind of people who were participating in the action learning sets, have they become kind of more confident, including older volunteers, as a result from the conversations that you've had, from the challenges that you've overcome? And by all means, any of our kind of presenters can pop their hand up to kind of take that question.
I might very quickly say I think that they have, and I think one of the things that we talked about as a group is that when you're changing some really tricky volunteer management issues within your organisation, you know, whether that's influencing other colleagues, you know, to make changes around how they involve volunteers, or perhaps, you know, some difficult volunteer management situations, change takes time. So I think within the 6 months that the action learning sets were taking place, there were some quick wins where, you know, some organisations were able to go back and make, you know, quick changes to their volunteer recognition processes or to recruitment processes, or think about a certain bureaucratic process that could be tweaked in order to help older people feel more engaged. But some of the stuff within the kind of cultural strand of the outcomes framework, there was a recognition that that does take time, you know, and it's about changing the whole organisation, not just the volunteer management programme. But I don't know if Judith and Susanna will have more to say.
Judith, you've got your hand up, and then we can go to Rachel.
Yeah, it was just agreeing really with everything there that Laura said, but it's also about don't be frightened to have a go and do it. And what the action learning sets for me were great because it enabled you to think differently. You know, if you do what you've always done, you'll always get the same result, won't you? So if you do something differently, you will get a different outcome. And I think as long as you engage people along the way and they understand what you're doing, then, you know, people do get on board with it. And older people, yeah, maybe sometimes do take a little bit longer to understand why you're doing it, but that's maybe because you've not explained in the first place properly what you're doing and where you're going and where you're heading. So yeah, it's like it for me, it's just given confidence to look at and tackle things differently. So yeah, definitely.
Great, thank you, Judith. And over to Rachel.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on one of the projects that we were able to grant fund previously, and that was a community gardening project, and they co-designed with current volunteers how they were going to make their gardens more their garden volunteering, I mean, more open and inclusive. And as they did that with the volunteers, they were able to design it obviously with the volunteers all the way through. And so that made the people who were running the gardens obviously more confident, because they'd done it with people themselves, rather than having a system that was kind of there. If people came, they came. So I think that's sort of involving people as much as possible right from the start of developing things is a way of, yeah, ensuring that you're doing things right for the people who are involved.
That's great, thank you. And then kind of just kind of reflecting from one of the conversations that we were having in my kind of breakout room, because there was an organisation that kind of over kind of COVID, where you had to kind of pivot really quickly in terms of the way that you kind of recruited, trained, supported your volunteers, invested lots of kind of time and energy in kind of moving all of their kind of training online. And now that they've kind of done that, it hasn't kind of that they've said that it's actually kind of proved a bit more kind of time consuming to kind of follow up with potential volunteers, asking them why they haven't done it, and to do an awful lot more kind of handholding support to get people through those kind of online training modules. We've heard today that kind of older people don't always kind of engage as well kind of through online training. How do we kind of persuade people within our organisation to actually take a step back and move away from kind of online, or at least to kind of offer some sort of kind of hybrid kind of model where you can do it in person or paper based, and it doesn't all have to kind of be done kind of online kind of through a screen? Would anyone have any kind of tips of how you've overcome kind of that challenge of winning kind of the hearts and minds with your colleagues? Judith, thank you.
Sorry, yeah, probably just because we've actually done it. We had to do a training needs analysis. So coming from a training background, before you develop any kind of training, you should always really, involve the potential participants. And the results speak for itself then. So in some ways you've got less persuading to do when you can show the results of your training needs analysis to the management and say, look, this is what all the feedback is showing and saying, and therefore we need to look at doing something differently. And that's then where, again, you can, once you've developed it, you pilot it and you go back to your evaluation of it to make sure that you've got it right. So for me, it is sort of a process that you have to follow, because you've got to be able to demonstrate that you're not just changing for changing's sake, you're changing it because of the feedback that you've had from the people who are involved doing it.
Perfect, that's great practical advice. Thank you, Judith. And then there's been a question just about kind of like insurance kind of volunteers. So when you're kind of engaging kind of younger people kind of age kind of 18 or 16 or under, you might need to kind of notify your insurer that you are engaging children and young people in volunteer roles. Is there anything around kind of engaging kind of people at the older end of kind of the age spectrum in terms of kind of insurance? Would anyone know? And that might be something for us to kind of take away.
I can jump in on that, Nick, if it's helpful.
Oh yeah, please do.
Sorry, I'm not one of, but I'm just, because we've recently, or not too long ago, looked at this, and there are some insurers who have an upper age limit. So you do have to check with your insurance policy, although that's not constant. For instance, our policy inherently doesn't have that, but it is something you'll want to look into.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anna. And then there's been another question about this has been a project that's been running for 6 to kind of 12 months. But are there any plans of kind of what might kind of come next, either for the Centre for Ageing Better or for NCVO? Or what are our kind of hopes and aspirations for this kind of piece of work kind of going forward as well? Rachel, did you want to go first, and we can go over to Laura?
Yeah, I can very quickly say that at the Centre for Ageing Better, we're not continuing with our work in this area, which is why the grant was made to NCVO, because NCVO is so perfectly positioned to be able to spread the learning through the work that you've been doing and events like this as well. So although we're not doing active work, it's something that we're, obviously the way that people, older people, are able to engage with their communities is of interest, real interest to us, but it's not an active work stream any longer.
Thank you. And then Laura, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, so that's a very pertinent question, because I believe we will be asking all the participants that very question as part of the follow-up to today. So the project officially ends at the end of this month. Our lovely evaluation team at NCVO are working on some learning insights right now, which I believe are going live on our website tomorrow. So that captures the formal learning from the project to date. And we're really keen to keep this going. And so it's one of the questions that we put to our project steering group, and they had some suggestions like, think about how this might fit in with the vision for volunteering, which I know some of you have suggested brilliantly in the chat, to continue delivering the age-friendly inclusive volunteering principles and outcomes framework within the good practice in volunteer management training, because that has a great reach, particularly of very new volunteer managers to start thinking about that. But I think that, there's so much potential for this, and there's a great need for it, that we are going to ask volunteer managers as a follow-up to this session, so that you can give us your ideas for not just a legacy for the project, but how and who should be responsible for taking this learning forward.
Brilliant, thank you. And then we'll finally just pop over to Susanna.
No, yeah, just really quickly, and I guess it's something Judith mentioned earlier in terms of the action learning sets, that I guess initially there was really good attendance and loads of people came, and as kind of time went on, there were less and less people attending. And I know someone else has asked in the chat if there might be more action learning sets, and I guess it'd be really good to hear everyone's thoughts who's on this call about kind of the next steps, and if something like that might be helpful. Judith and I certainly found it a really helpful tool, but I know lots of other organisations such as AVM look at setting up kind of networking groups and those sorts of things, and they seem to kind of go quite well for a while and then kind of peter out, and whether that would be something that's helpful, or whether actually it's something else, and if they are helpful, I guess persuading people that actually they are really helpful to take a step away from the day-to-day to come along to.
Certainly, yeah, kind of action learning sets are a great tool and a great thing to be kind of a part of and engaged in. And I think most people kind of online, or hopefully most people online, are part of, if you're from a volunteer centre, you might be part of the volunteer centre managers kind of Google group. So we could always kind of have a conversation around kind of bringing together an action learning set together through that group. But for those of us joining us from kind of volunteer involvement organisations, perhaps if you kind of fill out the SurveyMonkey feedback form, if you state that you'd be interested in being part of an action learning set, we might be able to kind of look at ways that we could kind of bring people together, maybe on an informal basis. I'm not sure that we would necessarily have the funds per se to kind of bring together like a consultant to kind of manage and facilitate that action learning set, but we could definitely kind of explore some challenges or issues that you're experiencing together in a bit of a more kind of informal way. But I think that probably kind of brings us to a bit of an end of the Q&A. There was, of course, like a comment in there about kind of how we can bring this to life kind of through the vision for volunteering. And the vision will really be kind of ramped up kind of from April kind of moving forwards, where NCVO and the partnership with the vision for volunteering will be welcoming kind of 3 new members of staff. So there's going to be a whole kind of series of kind of roadshows kind of taking place over the summer months. And I imagine kind of age-friendly inclusive volunteering would definitely going to fit into the themes around kind of power, equity and inclusion and experimentation as well. So I have no doubt that many of you will be participating in some of those kind of roadshows activities that will be taking place throughout the kind of summer months. But just to move back to our final kind of couple of slides, and I can just start sharing my screen again. Do bear with me. So kind of today we've kind of moved through, or we've kind of referenced lots of kind of tools, resources, kind of bits of information, which are all on this kind of slide now. We'll be sending out the full slide deck as part of the kind of follow-up email to you all. So on this slide, all of these things are hyperlinked that you'll be able to kind of follow through kind of from the slide deck as we send over to you. So this includes Susanna's blog that shares learning and reflections from NCVO's Age Inclusive Volunteering Project. It also includes links to the data that we've drawn upon today, so from the Community Life Survey and the NCVO Almanac, as well as thinking through to NCVO's Involving Volunteers, tools, resources and further guidance. So we're almost at the end of our 90 minutes together. And before we go, Sophie's just about to launch a snap poll to get your views on how you found today's session, which will appear on your screen any second now. She's also going to post a link to a short SurveyMonkey evaluation where you can provide more detailed feedback on the things that you liked, the things you didn't like, where we can make improvements or offer you more support. And as Laura said as well, the feedback form also includes a question around kind of what can NCVO do to continue promoting learning and good practice in age-friendly inclusive volunteering. We would love to get your thoughts and feedback on how you think we can take this forward in the months and the years to come. But before we sign off, on behalf of kind of Laura and my colleagues at NCVO, I'd like to give a special thanks to Rachel, to Susanna and to Judith for their time and their contributions today. And of course, thank you to all of you too for spending this morning with us. Enjoy the rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you again in the very near future.